I'm going to start by asking a question that I know the answer to. Who is stressed at work? Who's got too much work to do and not enough time to do it? Well, I think quite a lot of people would put their hand up to that. My fifth participant, when I was interviewing, came to me by serendipity, wasn't planned. That's how a lot of my research has happened, by the way. It was my supervisor. My supervisor said to me, I'm only supposed to be supervising 5 postgrad students, and suddenly I find that I've got 12. And that's getting in the way of doing what I would like to do and what I think my job is, which is research, presenting at conferences, collaborating with other researchers, thinking and writing. And this demonstrates a tension that exists within most organizations. And I'm going to just step back and we're going to look at this from a systems perspective. And this is really the way organizations have been designed. And this is fine. This is the industrial metaphor. But we need to understand this because the way that we manage systems or organizations today has now come adrift from the way that they're designed. And look, how I work, where I work in tech, that's one of the first things that we do is we show the amount of work in progress so that people can see what's happening. We also work very much on flow. We're interested in what's happening at this end, how much of what's going into the process is coming out the other end and being valuable. What happens a lot is people get blocked and work just builds up inside of here, so you don't get the flow. So you're really interested here in making flow. And as I say, this is all stuff that came out of the back end of the last century. This is all lean process control. This is very well known and understood theory, but it's rarely taught to managers. So we've now reached this situation where we've got a tension. Tension is between what the process can do, people, machines, system, teams, organization, what it can do and what the demand wants it to do. And if you look at the micro foundation, if you look at what's happening on the ground, nobody wants to say no to anybody else in their organization, their colleagues or their superiors, or they're just people that you want to make happy, right? So you don't really want to say, I can't do that now. We also don't want to take it on because when we take it on, we're going to feel tense, pressured, and we're going to feel we might let them down, but we also might break. So that's not a good feeling. And when we're feeling like that under pressure, we're not working at our best. And you've noticed that I'm using words like feeling and like. They're not measurable. There is no dial that says this is how I'm feeling that you could read. Maybe I should put one on my forehead. And I'm not very good at noticing it about myself either, by the way. I happily take on far too much work, so I don't even notice my own indicator. But these are all intangibles. They're intangible, but they're real. So that's an issue in itself. And then the big one is this, is that unlike most of the things that we saw in industrial organizations, which were really mechanical and could be solved by complicated mechanical solutions, there aren't any easy solutions to this. Because there are so many stakeholders and so many different parts to this that you are very much dealing with a pluralistic situation. Any solution will only ever be temporary until you find out why it doesn't work. So you've got this very different environment. And this is, I feel, this is my thesis, this is the difference in the role of the manager as we've gone from an industrial age where it was clear where we were going and strategy was cascaded down. And the manager's job was just to find the right methods to deliver that, to now there is no right method at all. And what managers are doing is they're much more connected with these intangibles, and managers seem to be creating and holding these adaptive space, sometimes called a safe space, in which people can talk about their feelings. And you'll notice that that's happened a lot since lockdown. You know, meetings beginning with check-ins, how are we feeling? That never used to happen, and that does now. And also people making comments like I had one interviewee who said, you know, we've got to get through 100,000 of these compliance tickets a month, but also we don't want to break people's backs to get that work done. Adaptive space exists in the complexity literature, exists in the coaching literature. Again, it's real, but it's not tangible. So that's my thesis. Why does any of this matter? Well, because we've moved from a machine age hierarchy, cascaded down. Strategy was unfolded in 3 different time spans. So the executive team would decide they're going to place a long-term bet on this market, this product, this gap. So that was a prediction. Then they would plan to build the machines and the mechanisms that they needed to fill that. And that's really about acquiring resource. And then there was the short term, which very often would be hiring, training, managing, balancing budgets. So you've got these 3 time horizons, long, medium, and short term. And once you're in that space, what you need to do is optimize for efficiency. Now, at the bottom of that pyramid, in this metaphor, the bottom of that pyramid was workers, workers and machines. Very often the workers were just pressing the buttons on the machines, but the bottom layer was very much human labor. And it didn't really matter so much what the tensions were, because you could ignore them. You were paying, in that medium term, you were paying for highly optimized processes. So the last thing that you wanted was a worker that changed the process. The process had already been optimized. So you wanted them to follow an optimized process. And that leads to the sort of thinking that says you can't really trust these workers. Things don't look like that in modern tech-driven organizations. If you think about a Google or an Amazon or CERN, the Research Institute, if you think about those, they're run by scientists and engineers. They think differently. They're not so much interested in rank and hierarchy. They're not always interested in managing, actually. Managing is just a different career path. You know, you can be an engineer, you can be a manager. It doesn't really matter. And this way of thinking is much more about an ecosystem in which complexity happens. So the organization is merely a container for a complex adaptive system. There may well be other systems, ecosystems that it interacts with. So you can think of Google, if you like, or Amazon. Let's think of Amazon as a platform, and it just enables other organizations to connect. So you're very much about, we're part of a system. So you're thinking differently, and that system adapts because it's people-based. People adapt to whatever's going on, and that includes adapting to ideas that they have. So there was the famous Google A/B test, you know, which color performs better. The engineer was able to say, okay, this color of blue is better for both AdWords and AdSense. So you get an emergent strategy. That strategy emerged. Nobody ever thought of it. And actually, the story was the engineer just informed their manager of what they had done. And if the stories are to be believed, Amazon made $100 million out of that decision. The point being that in a tech world where delivery is instant and at scale, it costs nothing to deliver a solution to 1 million people. It costs nothing. Everything moves very fast. So you've got to have the ability to adapt your strategy as fast. And in that kind of world, you're optimizing for adaptation. Tensions there are constraints. They do change behaviors, but they don't control behaviors. So we make decisions based on experiment. Experiment becomes the norm rather than you do what you're told. And in that context, you want managers to enable what's going on rather than direct. So this is a very, very different landscape. It's a network landscape. It's not top down. When it comes to change or transformation, it has to emerge and adapt rather than be pushed from the top down. And that's really where my job comes in. I'm hired as part of organizational transformations. Typically they're called Agile transformation. The word comes from the Agile Manifesto for Software Development, 2001. And that really did change the way that we developed software into a much more socio-technical way, where in fact we value interactions between people, particularly developers and customers or end users, and developers and systems people internally. The collaboration was more important than the process. And the idea is that if that worked for software and transformed software, then it should be able to work in organizations as a whole. Unfortunately, there's no evidence that says that there is any method of scaling that. There's a little bit more research for what's called digital transformation, which is ultimately it's moving the value proposition and what's delivered of value from analog over to digital. So we're moving to digital. You can think about newspapers and journals, they are nearly all digital. In practice, I really just want to help managers improve their organizations. So I coach and I talk to people about developing leadership at all levels. They're typically developing themselves as leaders. So instead of seeing the organization that they work for, and these are big organizations, 200,000-300,000 people, instead of seeing that as this giant oil tanker that takes forever to turn around and they can't change its direction, what I'm helping them just reframe is what they are able to do. And that's lead very small changes. Managers at every level are able to unblock things that certainly somebody at the lower level cannot do. So everybody is looking to the level above. What I'm helping managers to do is just suggest that they become leaders, they do the unblocking, and they encourage people below them to do the unblocking. And they love it because then they're not only doing the right thing for their organization, but they're doing the right thing for the people that they're responsible for. And that feels good. It feels right when you do it. So as I delved into the literature, I came across a much cited paper by James March, 1991, where he talks about, there's two things that a firm does, is developing and improving on your old certainties. You've got your production line and you just get slightly better and slightly better at that, versus exploring new possibilities. Now, the language he used was exploiting old certainties, cringe, versus exploring new possibilities. So unfortunately we get these terms in the literature, and just to reference it, you see that a lot. But the field itself is called ambidexterity, and it's all about the recognition that an organization over a time must come up with new ideas and learn how to make profits from those ideas. And you've got to be good at both of those. Now, that idea was first noticed in the 1970s. Duncan wrote a paper for probably the first ever conference on organizational research, which was design. And he noticed that orgs have dual structures. So you have an R&D department within an operational company. He called it a dual structure. And within that context, Tushman and O'Reilly have been very, very active in this literature. They came up with a very popular paper that talked about the need for revolution. And it was really a call to managers to not be scared, to every so often just throw everything that they've done away and say, look, we've done that, let's do something new and different. And their examples included the RCA valve company. So valves, old classic vintage guitar amps and stuff like that. The company doesn't exist anymore because they decided not to adopt transistors. Even more stark example, I suppose, is Kodak. But they did invent digital photography, but because they saw themselves as a chemicals company and their innovation was about chemicals, they just didn't see themselves as innovators with tech. They didn't do anything about it. And it is believed that it was a spreadsheet thing. There was no room on the spreadsheet to say, yeah, we're exploring this digital photography thing. So they didn't. Now, Leventhal and March, the same James March, wrote this paper where they explained one of the reasons for this is that you get very good at doing one particular thing. And indeed, silos exist because you have to be very good. So let's say that you're doing tech research. You're very good at that. But also there are different, I suppose, philosophies around it. You're thinking longer term, your control mechanisms are much more time-based. You do an iteration of research and then you look at where you've got and then you do the next bit, rather than the plan-driven, we know where we want to get to, so we'll work back. But the other thing that they pointed out, and they were very polite about it, Edwards Deming was less polite, is short-termism. They said it's much easier to improve efficiency in the short term. If you just improve an existing process, you're more likely to succeed than if you're trying to invent the next big thing. Well, you're not going to succeed. 99 times out of 100, you're going to fail on that. But when you do invent the next big thing, boy, are you going to win big. So there is a propensity for managers for whom failure is not an option to just go with where the success is. Now, ambidexterity, therefore, bridges that. It says you got to get to be good at both. I'm going to propose, I've not seen this in the literature, but I propose that ByteDance is a really good example of this. So they're a tech firm. They have a software development factory. All they do is they chuck out new apps. It takes about 100 days for them to build a new app. So there's the production. That's the highly efficient exploiting these software developers. And by the way, there have been some articles in the practitioner literature about what it feels like to just feel like you're in a software factory, just chucking out features. And it's not a good feeling. But the innovation comes in the ideas is, what do these apps do? They do different things. And if you're in the computer games industry, it's pretty much the same. You just got to keep hitting it. Anyway, ByteDance delivered a product, delivered an app, one of many, took 100 days. And 100 days later, they had their first 1 million users on it. ByteDance then became one of the software unicorns, company that's a startup that's worth $1 billion. And you'll probably know that app as TikTok. Guttel and Konlechner, they wrote about a research company that spends quite a bit of its time researching new tech and pharmaceutical, and quite a lot of time applying it. And what they noticed is that contextually, everybody knew where they were, which side they were, but they also knew that both sides were necessary to complement each other. But the absolute classic one in the literature, for me, the one that really matters to me and really struck me, is NUMMI. So NUMMI was a factory that was owned by General Motors in California, but the Toyota Japanese management came in to run it with American staff and management. So this was really applying the Toyota management system. I was reading at the time Taiichi Ohno's book about how he developed that system and therefore how he transformed Toyota Japan managers into this way of thinking. So for me, this was fascinating. And I knew quite a lot about the Toyota system because a lot of it is we see it in agile and lean anyway. Now, what they did there was they had huge 100-ton presses that would press out body panels. And that was highly efficient. So that was your exploitation. They were really good. They called that's the routine work. So it's pushing out these things. The established thinking is that you're highly efficient at that. So you keep that press running as long as you can and build a little stockpile, because that's mass production, and mass production must be good. And then when you've done enough of those, you spend the next couple of days changing the dies in these machines. And these are big multi-ton dies that support the different body shapes that you're pressing out. What Toyota did was understand that you needed to be efficient in these non-routine. So changing the dies was non-routine. And they did that in context. That meant that the managers and the workers collaborated. They had time to do this. They were incentivized to do it. They had training. They were trusted. So these are all contextual factors. And of course, they got it down to under 10 minutes. Absolutely fantastic. And that is, in part, that is the success of the Toyota production system. Now, we'll come back to that a little bit later when I reference Ohno's tensions again. So I started to look through the literature and I started to look for these tensions. And they're everywhere. Of course, everybody references marches, exploitation and exploration. And I got to wonder if sometimes people were just trying to find other words that weren't exploitation, because it doesn't read well today. So a lot of different tensions in the ambidexterity literature itself. I analysed these and I got them down to 6 different basic tensions. And then I looked at how managers might manage those tensions. And the fundamental one is just balance. That's what you'd expect managers to do. They play very often a diplomatic role. They're trying to balance egos and tensions and needs and all of that. So it's all about balance. McGrath and the cybernetics and systems thinking is all about variety and absorbing variety. So that's really, you need to understand how variation works. And that was Deming's big thing. And there's been some work actually in the NHS as well about teaching board level executives how to read performance charts so that they understand that there is a certain amount of natural variation that you must expect in the system, and what you manage is when it exceeds that. And that's really quite valuable and quite an easy thing to accommodate. I attended a lecture by Gerald Midgley of Hull University, so the systems thinking, critical systems thinking department, and he did some work in New Zealand whereby farmers were clashing with residents about the use of the land and the water and what they were growing and what they were spraying their crops with. Another colleague that I work with, her master's work was in Canada, and it was about fish farming off the coast. And of course, the salmon not only were very important to the economy, but the salmon were very, very important to the First Nation. They were their spiritual ancestors. So you get this tension between the exploitation that we need to do if we're going to take any advantage of the Earth's resources versus preserving them. But the ones that I think that are much more relevant to the organization and to managers that I'm interacting with, obviously I come from an agile technical background, and organizations want to be more agile. They don't necessarily know how to measure that, but they want that ability to change and deliver quickly and change what they're doing. But they also want to be seen to be very reliable and steadfast organizations. So that's got to be a tension. And my suggested approach for that is, if we develop leadership at all levels, I really mean by that, if you're a manager of a team that's a team of software developers, what if you were to trust that team to make the decisions as to what's right for the organization? How about they just remember the Google A/B testing, how about they just make the decision and then let you know what the outcome is? And that's tricky in a very controlling organization that says you have to get permission to do everything. If I want to use a software tool and I work in a bank, I can't, because there's all sorts of compliance and regulation that prevents me from doing that. So this becomes a limiting factor. It also ties into that reducing the variation. So I'm thinking of a bank that just the tech business of it was $1 billion business, and it only had 300 suppliers because they all had to conform to the standards and the preferred supplier list. So reducing variation, and that gives you the steadfastness because everybody's passed all of the checks and the balances. But it did also mean that nobody, as a manager or a developer on the ground, could make their own decision. They couldn't use the right tools or the best tools or do what was going to make life easier for them to deliver the right thing for the organization. So it's a tension, right? There's no right or wrong. It is a tension. The one that came up a lot speaking to people, really a lot, is the one that I opened with, is this idea that our intention is this. Our intention is to grow by 5% every year, and it's a reasonable intention, but the capacity of the organization is that it's very, very difficult to get things done. It takes a long time to organize a meeting with 12 heads of different departments, and yet the intention is that the heads of departments will agree to do this, this, and this. And yet the first hurdle is we can't get everybody together in the same room. And that's sometimes called the strategy execution gap. And as I suggested before, we need to empower workers. We need to recognize that workers are able to self-organize. The bottom of the pyramid now is not workers, that's computers. We are all thinking and knowledge workers. So we've got to be able to say to the people that are doing the work, and by the way, managers are knowledge workers as well. We got to say to them, you must self-organize and you must manage the flow of your work and also the amount of work that you're taking on. And when you've reached that work in progress limit, you have to say no. And then I promised you I'd come back to this one. This was Ono-san in his book about how he developed the Toyota production system and the challenges that he had with very traditional Japanese industrial managers. He very much had to put ego to one side and say, let's just do an experiment to see what happens. Going back to those panels, he said the illusion is mass production is cheaper. So you make as many panels as you can and you stack them up on one side, or you put them in the inventory store. and you call them off when needed. And his idea was we only make as many panels as are needed. And that's all, no more, because any more would be waste. And we just get very, very good at making only what's needed. And you can see that's a massive shift. And he said it's an illusion that mass production is cheaper. So he had to prove it. And that's exactly what he did. And he did it through experimentation. Final part of the tensions puzzle is paradox. So paradox kind of goes beyond tension, if you like. It does talk about, or for me, this addresses this one-size-fits-all binary either-or reductionism that's very common in management. It's sort of this desire to simplify organizations. In their prize-winning paper, Smith and Lewis, 2011, and in their very recent book, which is all about both and thinking, they describe these paradoxes as being similar to the yin-yang. And that's lovely because it's both and. You need both sides. And there's always a little bit of one within the other. So you might remember that I spoke about, Henry Ford. So there's a little bit of creativity inside of that mass production. There is some creativity. Let's be creative and say you can only have one color. Right? So that was an innovation. And then the other thing that you get is movement, because he only did black is the only color you can have for a short while to establish a price point for the vehicles. After that, you could have any color you wanted. I like this both and thinking. It's a different way of thinking, and it suggests something that is much more naturalistic. This is how humans really are. We do need those both sides of all of us, and and the sun and the moon and the strong proteins and the cooling veg and all of that. I like the way that represents the natural complexity of the world. Got a couple of firms that have deliberately, intentionally embraced tensions. The first example is, I think they were probably the very first agile agency, outsourcing, consultancy firm. They're very successful, still going, very much a leader, called ThoughtWorks. And the owner of the company set out by copying Ben and Jerry's. So they wanted to be social, they wanted to be profitable, but they also wanted to be excellent. And that meant hiring top thinkers, and engineers, and being all of those things. So profitable and also acting in society's interests. So all big decisions had to go through that. Probably that fight, that argument is, what do we do? Do we take on this client? Do we agree with what this client is doing? Do we want to build this bit of software for that client, knowing what they're going to do with it? And they were very successful. Just like Ben and Jerry's, they sold out as a profitable organization to private equity. Another one is WiseTech, an Australian company. Now, they noticed something that I think exists in a lot of organizations, especially product-led organizations. They applied Goldratt's theory of constraints, or one of the tools from Goldratt's TOC, which was the reducing cloud. They noticed all of these problems and tensions kept arising. And when they boiled them down, they sort of, you reduce these things down. What's at the core? What's at the core? What they found out at the core of a lot of their problems was a disagreement between, do we ship the thing now, or do we wait until we've got all the bugs sorted out, right? Do we make something that's really reliable and not going to come back and make us do rework, which of course is wasteful, or do we deliver it as soon as possible to get it into the market to have that early mover advantage? And this speed versus quality debate, tension, is very, very common. And they made a decision and they resolved it. And they said, we're going to go with quality. That's it. And the way that they've done this with several different, they call these persistent conflicts. So it had to be something that was persistent, and it was actually a conflict, source of conflict. So they do it with a mantra. They just come up with a mantra and it's on the wall, and anybody could say, I think this is a slower today, faster tomorrow, faster forever problem. And that solves it. Your decision is made. We have decided, executive decision is we're going with quality. So you can see from the chart, that's their stock price. They seem to have done quite well with it. And then I believe that the poster child for ambidextrous practice is this. When I started developing software, we would release software into production, and the people in charge of production, the operations team, they really didn't want us to release anything, because every time developers release something, it made change in production. Change is when you increase the risk of problems. So you had this natural tension. And what changed, or what DevOps did, was it changed the culture, and it says, what if developers and operations staff work together and we only have DevOps teams? They're the same people. The DevOps research has shown, and we've had several years of this, and there is theory as well behind it. What this has shown is that high-performing DevOps organizations are 6,570 times faster at delivering change into production environments. And the tiny small print there says, yeah, this is not an editorial mistake. They really are 6,500 times faster. That also means the TTR is the time to recovery. Because they can get changes into production that much faster, it means that they recover from errors that much faster as well. So you've got fantastic performance going on. My research, it continues to be serendipitous. I meet people, we talk, they're telling me, yeah, we really get these tensions. They're telling me about new tensions and about new ways of managing them, or sometimes not managing them, like stepping away from a tension because the ethics of it was so uncomfortable that they just don't want to be there. I spoke to one CTO that said, I've had to build integration layers between not just the tech, but also the people. So these are tensions. This is the way that they've managed the tensions. And then the one about the 100,000 compliance checks and not breaking colleagues' backs. You know, that was a delightful conversation with a relationship manager at a bank. And what they did was nothing other than gather people together and speak to them and just form that internal community. And that to me is real indication of how managers are changing the role of managing. So that's pretty much my research. That's where I'm at. I'm still talking to people. I'm still having conversations, both with individual managers and also groups of managers, so I can form case studies. And if you're interested in being part of that, I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening.